All right, welcome everybody. This is class number 9. It's actually class number 8 for those who are counting because we skipped one or two, or skipped one, I think. Pesach, that we'll do coming up. So right, the festival, the holiday of Purim is coming up, and we're celebrating in the religious school this week, and it falls out in a couple weeks during spring break, and so it's a bit of a challenge. And so we're celebrating a little bit early in the religious school. All right, here we go. Today, we're talking about the Rabbinic Revolution. So it wasn't always rabbis who led the Jewish people. At first, they were prophets, right? And then kings, and then priests in the Holy Temple. And finally, rabbis, right? So the rabbis came after the temple fell. And so we're going to learn a little bit about the history of the origins of the rabbis and how rabbis became the leaders of the Jewish people. Just as an introduction, our main ancestors come from prophets, who are the leaders of the Jewish people, and priests, Kohanim, that were leaders in the temple. And so those are our two main sources of the rabbinic origin, our two main ancestors. And as it turns out, the rabbis are called upon to do both of those jobs. So it's a little bit tricky, and rabbis balance one way or the other usually. So for example, there are prophetic rabbis. Those are the rabbis that stand on the pulpit, brimstone and fire and brimstone, right? And try to move the Jewish people forward. And they take risks, right? And they're out there in front, social action, protests, right? All that sort of thing. And that's the prophet, right? That's the prophet's job. And then another job of the rabbis is priests, as Kohanim. So the priests organize ceremonies and pursue peace, right? Peace between people, peace in the community, peace on earth. And they're more peaceful rabbinic. So as you would imagine, right, the priestly rabbis who pursue peace and mediators, non-confrontational, right? So I lean a little bit towards that end because, right, I come from a non-confrontational family, but also a Levitical family. My father was a Levi and his father was a Levi. And so we actually come by it honestly because we're Levi'im who served in the temple alongside the Kohanim. And so I'm a pursuer of peace and a lover of peace. And there are rabbis that are also out there, right? Out there in front, taking risks, pushing, right, the agenda forward. And as you can imagine, those kind of rabbis have short tenures in synagogues, right? Because they're more assertive, right? And take risks. And sometimes they're out too much in front of the congregation, right? And so I'm enjoying a long tenure here at Brit Shalom. And I think that's probably because, I take after the priestly ancestors and more pursuers of peace. So that's sort of a little bit of insight into the contemporary rabbi. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. And we're going to go through our PowerPoint here. All right, this is the story about the revolution of Rabbinic Judaism. It's the story of how Judaism came to the brink of extinction after the temple fell almost 2,000 years ago, right? So it was really on the verge. There was no path forward, but instead of dying out completely, it reinvented itself completely, right? So the Judaism we practice now is completely different than the Judaism we practiced before the temple fell, right? And there's a total revolution in Jewish law and Jewish practice, what the center, right? The Holy Temple was the center of the Jewish people, religiously, politically, right? And everything else. It was just the center of the Jewish people geographically. And when the temple fell and we were banished and exiled from Jerusalem, we had no Judaism, right? And so Judaism needed a remake, needed a Judaism 3.0, right? And the Rabbinic Revolution was the evolution of Judaism, right? And so a little bit of history before we begin, right? And so the end of the Babylonian exile, first the temple fell and we were exiled to Babylonia. Lasted only a short time, a couple of decades. And then King Cyrus of Persia said, okay, you guys can come back to Jerusalem. Many came back and many stayed in Babylonia. And you can see 515 was the rededication of the second temple after folks started coming back. It was a small temple, much like the first temple. And much later, we'll see under King Herod, it was expanded quite a bit. And the Western Wall was created as one of the outside walls. In 450, I'm saying 500, the canonization of the Torah. So something was delivered on Mount Sinai, 10 Commandments, a revolution of spirit, but the actual text of the Torah is believed to happen here, 450 BCE. In the Orthodox tradition, right, it was all given on Mount Sinai, whole and complete, but we believe that it was an evolution happened, and it was finally canonized at 450 BCE, which is also a very long time ago, right? And so any objections to our philosophy, right, can be quelled a little bit by, it's still a very long time. And what a miracle it was to develop and evolve over so many decades. Alexander the Great conquers the land of Israel from the Persians. And so Alexander the Great comes in, and what makes Alexander so great is he figured out a way to build an empire, which is, instead of ravaging and destroying people as he went along, he decided, you know what, you can pay dues, pay tribute to the empire, and still be and still have your own culture, but pay tribute to Greece. And so that worked out quite well for Alexander the Great. And then, but slowly he began to, and the next king decided to put the clamps on the individual cultures and started forcing, right, Greco-Roman culture onto the empire. And then the Maccabees revolt happened, right? And then that's a little bit later, the emergence of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes that we'll talk about. I'm doing this pretty quickly because we'll go into more detail in just a moment. 63 BCE, Rome takes control of the land of Israel, right? And that's where we get the beautiful colonnades in Caesarea and Caesarea and Masada, right? Rome takes control and builds these beautiful, right, decorative buildings. Debates of Hillel and Shammai. This is where the pre-rabbis, the proto-rabbis, start becoming popular under Hillel and Shammai. There's Jesus, right there in the middle. During this rabbinic revolution, right, he is considered, one of the rabbis, prophets that were around at the time. At Masada, the Zealots revolt against the Roman Empire, and they run south to Masada, which was a vacation home that Herod built, a winter home, because it's nice and warm in the winter and down in the desert. And it was empty at the time, and the Zealots went up there and camped out. Didn't end well for the Zealots. We'll learn about that in a minute. And then the second temple was destroyed, and we were banished. And then out in the diaspora, there are a couple of revolts that are important. One was the Bar Kokhba revolt that was trying to uproot the Roman Empire from the land of Israel. And then in 200 CE, we sort of gave up and said, you know what, leave Jerusalem in Roman hands. We're going to go north. And the rabbinic communities were born, particularly Rabbi Yehuda the Prince. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi compiles the Mishnah that we'll talk about in a moment. Emperor Constantine legalizes Christianity, and that's how it started getting spread. Right, the emperor later on Christianizes Rome, right? And that's the official time when it started spreading. And then there's the Babylonian Talmud, which we'll talk about in just a moment. I know I did that pretty quickly. We'll go over it a little bit more in depth now. Here's the early Second Temple period, right? And as I mentioned before, King Cyrus was a benevolent king, and he allowed the Babylonian exile to end, and they were invited back to go to the land of Israel. And that's when the Second Temple was rebuilt. Ezra and Nehemiah, right, were considered the scribes who wrote down the Torah. Alexander the Great comes in 333 BCE. And then Ptolemy and the Seleucids take over from there. And that's when the Maccabee revolution against Ptolemies and Seleucids started happening. The Maccabees are the last great Jewish kingdom. Antiochus, right? You can tell that's already a Greek name. Right? Was the leader of Jerusalem, the Maccabean revolt. And then the Maccabees are considered good soldiers because they successfully overthrew the yoke of the Roman Empire. But they were very bad rulers, which means that they turned into corrupt politicians in the temple. And Jesus sort of had a point, right? Jesus is one of those prophets that turned over the money tables and said, wait a minute, this is all a business and it's corrupt. And he wasn't wrong. He was one of many rabbis and prophets who were railing against the corruption that was in the temple. The temple was being run by corrupt leaders. And we'll learn a little bit about that in a moment. The Romans entered Jerusalem in 63 BCE at first, right? They're benevolent and allow us to keep our culture, but then they put the clamps on and decide no more, right? King Herod was one of those benevolent kings, and he had some Jewish ancestry in him, right? And interestingly, he was from a people called the Edomians, and they were the only peoples, the only culture that were forcibly converted into Judaism. They're the only ones, right? And so that's how Herod had some Jewish ancestry, but didn't really embrace his Judaism. But Rome thought, hey, he's going to be a great person to put into place to watch over Jerusalem, because he'll perhaps be more well accepted than any other Roman leader. And so finally, the Roman tyranny happens, and they outlaw the study of Judaism, and they outlaw the study of Torah, and that causes a major revolt, right? And so we're going to see that the Jewish people splintered about how to deal with the Roman tyranny. And so they split up into 4 groups that we'll learn about in just a moment. The Bar Kokhba revolt, there was a series of revolts to try to overthrow the Roman rule. Bar Kokhba was one of those figures that successfully gathered a band of fighters and people to revolt. He was backed by a lot of the rabbis, right? And didn't work. The Bar Kokhba revolt failed, and Rome really cracked down on the Jewish people after that. So here's what happened, right? So as the Roman Empire was putting the clamps on Judaism and not allowing us to practice our Judaism, we had to figure out how to respond, right? And there's 5 here, but the 4 major ones plus the Jesus community. So the 4 major Jewish sects here, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the the Essenes and the Zealots, right? And it's just a fascinating part of our history, and teaches us about diverse responses to cataclysmic events in Judaism. Right? And so there are theories that, right, if you only have one response to the cataclysmic events in Jewish history, then there's a chance that it won't work and Judaism will be destroyed. It's actually a good thing that we splintered into 4 groups, because the odds are better that one of them is going to work, right? So a bunch will fail, but maybe one of them will work. The odds are better with 4 responses than they are with 1, right? And so here are the 4 responses, and 1 worked, 1 survived. So the Pharisees, right, are the Jewish people that decided, you know what? Instead of having Rome has the temple, right? So that's out of the question. It's corrupt and has Roman influence, and it's just not going to work anymore. And so the Pharisees decided, we're going to take Judaism out of the temple and recreate Judaism in the home and recreate Judaism in synagogues, right? And we're going to make it portable, right? So I'll give you a foreshadowing. The Pharisees are the ones that survived and were turned into the rabbinic community, but they decided to give up on the temple as it was corrupt and unsalvageable. And they decided to create a different kind of Judaism that didn't revolve around the temple, that revolved around the home, right? Having the Shabbat table and and studying Torah, right, in the home, in chavruta, study pairs and study partners, and they started learning how to do things in this day and age, right? And so they started writing down some stuff and memorizing some stuff that turned into our holy books, the oral tradition. But here are the Pharisees that said, you know what, temple's not working anymore. We're going to find a new kind of Judaism. And at this point, they had a Torah scroll, right, which is also portable, as we know. And so they started this rabbinic revolution that turned into the Jewish experience. Here are the failed options. Right? The Sadducees were the aristocracy who worked in the temple. So these were the temple priests, and they were colluding with the Roman Empire, and it was going quite well for them. They were wealthy, they're accepting tributes from everybody. They lived right near the temple, and there's still some of the ruins that you can go and see. The Sadducees were doing quite well. They were running the temple and accepting gifts from all the Jewish people as they came to offer their sacrifices, and they had quite a business happening. And so they colluded with Rome and were living a happy life for a while. Yes. The Essenes decided, you know what? Unlike the Pharisees, we got to get out of town. So the Pharisees kind of stayed in Jerusalem and did their work there. The Essenes said, forget it. We're going out to the Dead Sea, and we're going to live a different kind of life. So Joseph Telushkin calls them an ascetic, disciplined group of ancient hippies, right? So they went out to the desert and they lived there in sort of a commune. And they looked over at Jerusalem, figuratively, metaphorically, and said, that's finished. And so what's left? They lived in the desert, and they were the sons of light, battling against the sons of darkness. And so they lived this esoteric kind of life. They dressed in white. There are mikvaot that they built, right? And they went into the Dead Sea and did a lot of purification with water. Right, and they wrote a lot, right? And so we have those Dead Sea Scrolls from the Essenes, and it's a fascinating study of how they compare and contrast to the canonized books that we have today. right? So they were in the desert, they were writing, they were praying, they were dreaming of the Messianic era, and there weren't a lot of women, right? And so the math didn't work, and turns out that they fell in the desert. They went extinct out in the desert. The Zealots were more intense Pharisees, so they believed in a lot that the Pharisees believed in, but on a more radical, intense level. Right? And so what happened was they started fighting pretty seriously with the Roman Empire, trying to overthrow them, which obviously isn't a great idea because of the strength and power of the Roman Empire, and the resources that the Roman Empire had in terms of war, and their excellent warriors, all kinds of innovative cannonballs and all kinds of pulley systems, and just they had all kinds of ways to fight that were way ahead of their time. And so not a great idea. And so they took up arms and tried to fight against the Roman Empire. And they were so radical that they had little knives in their pocket. In Hebrew, they're called sikarim, I think, and named after the knives that they used to keep in their pockets. And they used to assassinate the Sadducee leaders, right, who were the ones who were corrupt, who were the ones who were colluding with the Romans. And so not only did they fight the Romans, they also fought the Jewish leaders, the Sadducees, right, who were corrupted by the temple and the Romans. So there are your four Jewish sects, right? The Pharisees took Judaism out of the temple and recreated the Judaism much like we have today in the synagogue and in the home. The Sadducees were the aristocratic folks who ran the temple and got wealthy and didn't mind the Roman Empire. They're doing quite well, right? And they enjoyed the bathhouses and the Olympiada, right? And the Colosseums, right? And so those were the Sadducees. And they also died out. And then the Essenes, who went down to the Dead Sea and lived this ethereal, esoteric kind of life. And then the Zealots, right, who were the warriors, the radical Pharisees who took up arms, right? And the Zealots ended up fleeing south because the Roman Empire was so strong. And they also ended up near the Dead Sea, and they found a place to escape. They found one of a vacated Herod's vacation home, which was on the top of Masada, and that's where they had their last stand. They said, right, we're not going anywhere. And the Roman Empire surrounded Masada and started, with their machinery, started climbing up and getting up towards the top. And the Zealots ended up with a suicide pact, and they all died up there on Masada, right? And so we can still climb up on Masada and imagine the story happen. And one interesting thing is when I think it's the paratroopers graduate from their training, they head up to Masada and they have their ceremony there. And they have a chant at the end that says, Masada Shenit Lo Yipol. Masada will never fall again. Right? We're never going to get put in that kind of situation where we're overthrown and weak. Right. And so the military that goes up there as a reminder of the history of being weak and vulnerable. And they say, never again. Right. That's not going to happen to us again. Right. So there you go. So the Zealots were a pretty bad example of how to take up arms. They fled and they ended up getting surrounded and died up on Masada. So there you go. There's our four sects. And then there's this Jesus community who were Christian Jews, right? So at first, they were very much a part of the Jewish community. And that's how they began. They practiced Judaism, but in a sort of different way, right? And right, they followed Jesus as their leader. And when Jesus died, he became more important to their experience, and finally became like a god, right? And so at that point, that's when they separated from Judaism, right? And it's interesting that at first they were discriminated against, right? They were the minority and the Jews were the majority. And so we started to kick them out of Judaism, and then it quickly flipped when they became so popular, and the Roman Empire made them the religion of the empire. So here we go with the temple gone, the priesthood decimated, the dream of independence smashed, right? It might have seemed like the right time for the Jewish story to end. We are on our last legs. We were almost dead. This was the end of the Jewish life. But then came the revolution. If not now, when? Right? So Hillel taught this important passage. This is where the Pharisees started to study, develop their philosophy, and develop their holy books that were much different than the written Torah, which we'll learn about in a moment. And Hillel used to say, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? So let's try to answer that question. It's sort of rhetorical, right? If I am not for myself, who will be for me? Nobody, right? We have to be self-sufficient. We have to be strong. We have to take care of ourselves, right? If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Nobody will be for me, right? I have to be for myself. It's a second statement. Question. If I am only for myself, what am I? Right? If I only care about myself, what am I? Nothing. Right? I barely exist if I'm not connected to the world. If I'm only looking inside as a community and as an individual, right? We need to connect with others. We need to love others like we love ourselves. We have to extend ourselves to our community, our family, and as a nation to other nations and other peoples. And how do we do both? We have to both take care of ourselves and we have to reach out to others. If not now, when? If I don't do it now, when am I going to do it? Never, right? And so it's an imperative to do both of these things at the same time, right? And so that's a beautiful statement about the way we have to interact with the world as individuals, right? We have to make sure that we have enough self-care for ourselves, and we have a responsibility to take care of others, both at the same time, right? We shouldn't say when I'm complete, when I'm fulfilled, when I'm perfect, right? Then I'll start taking care of others. Right? We can't say that because we're never going to be totally whole and totally shalem, totally satisfied and peaceful. And so we have to do both at the same time. So this is what an example of what Hillel, the early rabbi, was teaching. It began with a small group of survivors who before the revolt had belonged to a group called the Pharisees. Right? The Pharisees said, forget about the temple, we have to recreate Judaism. And then when the temple fell, there you go, they became the rabbis. The Pharisees, whose name means interpreters, had already started calling for a new kind of Judaism that was less centered in the temple and its hereditary priests, right? They stopped the idea of lineage, right? If your father was this, you're this, right? Now they stopped calling themselves Pharisees and adopted a new title. They began calling themselves rabbi, right? So here's the beginning of the rabbinic period. And that was a long time ago, but it's important to remember that it wasn't always this way. We had all kinds of different leaders in our Israelite community, in our Jewish community, namely the prophets and the priests, right, and judges. And now the survivor of this cataclysmic event were the Pharisees, right? The Essenes went away in the desert, right? Everybody, the Sadducees became corrupt and didn't last, and the Zealots ended up on Masada, and the victor, right, were the Pharisees, who turned into rabbis, right, interpreting the Torah for the modern age. And that's really what defines us, is we take the written Torah and evolve it for a more practical, contemporary lifestyle. And some of the stuff that's in there that's not applicable anymore, some of the ancient laws, right? An eye for an eye, for example, right? I think in many communities, ancient communities, they would poke your eye out, right? And if you stole something with your hand, they would cut off your hand. So that gets interpreted to mean compensation, right? So if you damage somebody, then you owe money, right? You have to compensate them for the worth of the damage. And so a lot of the verses that were interpreted literally, the rabbis started interpreting them metaphorically. The Rabbinic Revolution that they launched reinvented Judaism for an era without a temple and without a homeland, right? It was a traveling Judaism, a diaspora Judaism, right? And they always had one foot out the door, right? It was never okay to see your homeland in the diaspora as your forever home. They're ready to go. They're ready to flee, right? Whenever anti-Semitism raised its ugly head, right, they had a choice. Either they could stay there, right, and be decimated, or they could pick up and leave, because Judaism became portable. All you need is a Torah and some rabbis, and you're all set, right, to journey to a new community, right? And so we're the wandering Jews, right? The people, and those are the survivors, right? The people who stay and get stuck in a place like Germany, right, and Poland in recent years. Those are the ones that lose their lives, right? The ones that are bold, the ones that are free, right, and wander and brave and courageous. Can you imagine just leaving out, dropping everything and going to a new country, right? It's impossible for us to imagine here in America, the land of freedom, right? But there you go, right? We should always have one foot, one toe, how about that, ready in case, right? Just in case something goes horribly wrong, right? And now we have our homeland in Jerusalem, right? We call it in Israel, we call it our homeland, right? And right, we live here in America, but our spiritual home is in Israel. And God forbid, if something goes horribly wrong in the diaspora, which it does occasionally, right? Israel has a responsibility to help save the entire Jewish people, and they take that responsibility very seriously. As you remember, the raid on Entebbe, right, and the Ethiopians who were transported on airplanes out of Ethiopia, right, and landed in Israel, and so, right, the rabbinic period started the wandering Jewish experience, right? They taught that while God had once desired sacrifices, now God would be served by prayer, service, and deeds of loving kindness, right? And so they transformed the whole thing. God doesn't want our sacrifices anymore. What does God want from us? God wants prayer. God wants acts of loving kindness. God wants us to be kind to people, right? And so it was successfully transformed by rabbinic leadership. They taught that religious leadership is open to anyone. It's not hereditary anymore, right? You don't get it by being born into the cloth. But how do you get it? Those who attain their position by learning, not heredity, right? In the temple, right, it was passed on from family to family, right? And that's how it became corrupt. And so they looked back at history and said, we're not doing that anymore. What are we doing? Right? We're doing the leaders of the rabbinic communities were the ones who were the wisest, the ones who were the kindest, right? The ones who earned their leadership through hard work. The records of their discussions of Jewish law and practice form the basis of their masterpiece, the Talmud. And so we'll learn a little bit about the Talmud in a moment. More than 5,000 pages long, and written over the course of 500 years, the Talmud covered every conceivable topic in Jewish life. On its pages, the rabbis lay out their comprehensive view, the new vision for the Jewish future. Right? So Ben Zoma taught, here's another example of rabbinic philosophy and theology. Who is wise? One who learns from everyone. Right? And so there you see the democratic nature of the new Jewish experience. Who is wise? One who learns from everyone. Who is rich? One who is satisfied with their lot. Right? It's not a number, it's an attitude. Who is mighty? Not the Roman Empire who went around the world building an empire. One who conquers themselves. Right? And so it looked inward, and it looked for self development, right? And so this is the new Judaism, very different than the old Judaism of the temple. So here's a really important point. All modern expressions of Judaism, no matter where you are on the denominational spectrum, are rabbinic Judaism, not biblical Judaism, right? So part of the revolution here is a transformation from ancient biblical Judaism to a new kind of Judaism, which is rabbinic Judaism, right? So we don't live according to the Bible, right? We live according to rabbinic interpretation of the Bible, right? Very important, right? I have many conversations with fundamental Christians and all kinds of fundamentalists, Jews for Jesus, right? They point at Isaiah and they say, look, there's Jesus, irrefutable, right there in the verse. And I say, look, verses can be interpreted in so many different ways. You have one interpretation, good for you, right? We have 3 other interpretations that we also hold dear, right? And so just, you can't have one interpretation of a biblical verse. That's part of the rabbinic Jewish experience. And so here you go. Here's the oral tradition, which was developed over 500 years, right? And so it's made up of the Mishnah and the Gemara. So these are a couple terms that we need to know about. The Mishnah and the Gemara. So the Mishnah is the very first collection of rabbinic legal writings. It's compiled in 200 CE, closed down at, if you went from 0 to 200, and it's finally written down by Rabbi Yehuda the Prince up in the north of Israel. And you can still see that the community that Rabbi Judah the Prince lived in, obviously he was a wealthy man and well known in the community. Not exactly, he wasn't a formal prince, but he was called a prince because of his standing in the community. And when we went up north, we lived side by side with the Romans, right? We escaped Jerusalem and we went up to a more gentle place up in the north. As many of you know, the geography of the north is pleasant and mountainous and hilly and forests, right? And that sort of also lends itself towards the culture of the place, which was a more friendly place. And that's where in synagogues, you can see some tiles, right? Tiled floors with a zodiac on them and all kinds of not specifically Jewish art. And they also had figures on the walls of the synagogue, which we don't do anymore. We don't have any human figures in synagogues, but they were there, right? Up in the north where we were living in mixed communities together with the Romans. And that's where the Mishnah was compiled. Up in the north, we finally had some leisure time, especially the prince, Judah the Prince, had some leisure time to focus on the Mishnah. And a lot of these rabbis had day jobs, except for Judah the Prince. And in the evenings and at night, they compiled the Mishnah. They had conversations, and there were special Tanaim whose job was to memorize all the different opinions until finally it was written down. There was a fear that it might get lost, right? And so right, the memorization only goes so far, right? From generation to generation. And they finally said, in a very controversial decision, we need to write this down. And so that was the first compilation. At 200, they took a pen to parchment, or a quill to parchment, and started writing down the Mishnah so that they would have it codified for future generations. After 200 CE, right, we had the Mishnah, and then there were more conversations to be had, right? And so we did just that, right? The rabbis got together and they asked questions about the Mishnah, and they discussed the laws that were in the Mishnah. They told stories. They got more detailed into legal questions and legal arguments. The Mishnah is pretty straightforward, and sometimes it has, a majority opinion and a minority opinion. But in the Gemara, we have all kinds of opinions, and the logic gets worked through, and stories enter the picture to see if lore, right? Stories can help shed light on the Jewish law. And we needed to know how to live. We needed to know what to do. And so there are diverse opinions, and they fight it out, they battle it out in the Gemara. And so it's written in Aramaic, right? The Mishnah is in Hebrew, but the Gemara is in Aramaic, which was the language that they were speaking at the time. So Hebrew was the language that was inherited from generations before, but the Aramaic was like our English, right? It was written, right, in the language of the time. The extended commentary and expansion upon the Mishnah composed in both Babylonia and Israel between 200 and 500. We really focus on the Babylonian Talmud, surprisingly, because in Babylonia, they seem to have more time, right? They're a wealthier community, and they were able to really evolve the Mishnah and compile the Mishnah and the Gemara into something beautiful. In Israel, it was a little more sparse because they were consumed with making a living. It's hard in Israel, all right? The rains are sporadic, and it's hard to live in Israel, even today. So we learned about Mishnah and Gemara. So here's the equation. Mishnah plus Gemara equals Talmud, right? So when people refer to the Talmud, it's Mishnah and Gemara. Approximately 5,000 arguments, of which 50, less than 1%, come to definitive conclusions. Basically, it says the most Jewish book ever, right? And so 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And there are a lot of opinions. Sometimes the conclusion will lead towards one way or another, but there's no definitive conclusions in the Talmud. Here's what the Talmud looks like. Here's a page of Talmud written in the Aramaic, right? The first part here is the Mishnah. There we go. It goes down here until this spot here. It says Gimel Mem, which is the Gemara, right? So it's Mishnah plus Gemara equals Talmud. There's a page of Talmud. We've got the Mishnah here, and immediately after the first Mishnah comes the Talmud, right? And so that's the middle section is the Talmud, Mishnah plus Gemara. Now, it's pretty tough. The Aramaic is difficult to read and understand. The arguments get a little bit hairy and complicated. And so we need some explanation. And so Rashi comes to save the day. Rashi is here, always on the inside of the pages. And Rashi's job is to explain, right? Basically translate and help us out as we go through the Mishnah and the Talmud. And then on the left-hand side is called the Tosafot, which does intertextual explanations, which means, oh, it says in that place, you can't do this. How can it say you can do this in this place? And then they kind of try to explain contradictions that show up. And so, as you can see, there's layering here, right? And there's different generations of rabbis being put into conversation by the compiler of the Gemara. And we still don't know exactly who that was, but it's fascinating and work of genius, right? To put all these opinions that last generations into one document. All right, so a lot of things evolved even after the Talmud, right? So communal prayer, Shabbat candles, right? All these things came later, right? Kosher slaughter, saying the Kaddish, right? And meat and dairy dishes, right? All these laws that have evolved even after the Gemara. All right, so let's get to a couple of ideas. We only have a few minutes. We'll do 5 minutes each on these texts. So here's an example of a text that seems, it is cruel in the Bible, that the rabbis had to deal with and interpreted out of existence, right? And the line that I like to use is from Eitz Chaim Hi, from our tefillot, from our prayers. It goes Eitz Chaim Hi, right? A popular prayer. And it says, Diracheha darchei noam, all of the Torah's paths are pleasant, b'chol netivotei shalom, and all of its branches lead to peace. Right? And so that's the rabbinic prayer that the rabbis wrote in our Siddur. And here's an example of how they transform something not peaceful into peace. So here we go. So if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son, ben sorer umoreh, who does not obey his father and mother, will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him, bring him to the elders of the gate of town. They shall say to the elders, this son of ours is a wayward and defiant son. He will not obey us. He's a glutton and a drunkard. So what happens? All the men of the town shall stone him to death. Can you believe that? You must purge the evil from among you. All Israel will hear and be afraid. We'll make an example out of this kid, right? Because you have to respect your parents, honor your mother and your father. He's doing the opposite. And if this continues to flourish in the Israelite community, it'll lead to some very, very bad consequences. So here you go. You take this son and bring him to the elders and stone him to death. Right? That's what it says in the Torah. Comes the Mishnah and says, okay, you have the stubborn rebellious son. Let's talk about that. Right? At what point, number 2, at what point is he considered liable? At what point is he considered a rebellious son? When he eats a tartamar of wheat, like a whole bunch of meat, drinks half a log of wine, right? And it must be even more, says Rabbi Yossi, and a full log of wine. If he eats it at a mitzvah, a gathering for a mitzvah, or for a celebratory meal, right? Or, then none of this counts, right? If he eats any food other than meat, he has to specifically eat meat, and drinks any beverage other than wine, he isn't. So in other words, you can see the pattern here. The rabbis basically legislate this idea out of existence, right? If his father denounced him and his mother disagrees, which is likely, right? He is not liable. If his mother denounces him, his father disagrees, he is not. They must agree together, right? And if the mother isn't fitting for his father, then he all kinds of exceptions to the rule, and it goes on, right? And there's one crazy one right there, right? Right. So it has to be. What does it mean that his mother is not a fitting person? It means that they're okay. It must mean that his mother must be physically similar to her husband. They have to look the same in order for this to work. Right? The parents have to look. Right? It's kind of ridiculous at this point, right? In other words, it can never happen. Why? Because the Torah says, right, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so right, you get the idea, right? And which opinion does the teaching follow? It might be Rabbi Yehuda, who requires that the parents look and speak. It's not only they have to look similar, they have to speak similar. Right? They have to have voices that sound similar. It also might be Rabbi Shimon who taught this: just because a boy ate meat and drank wine, his parents will never take him out to be stoned, right? So this is never going to happen. However, Rabbi Yonatan said, I guess they have to have some credibility in the Torah. I once saw a stubborn rebellious son, and I even sat on his grave, oy vavoy, right? And so only one rabbi says, you know what, it once happened. But all the other rabbis say this can never happen. and they have so many specific requirements in order for him to qualify as a rebellious son, it just can't happen, right? So in other words, the rabbis can't say, we don't do that law anymore. They're not allowed to say that, right? Because we have to respect the Torah. However, the rabbis have a lot of rabbinic license to interpret these laws out of existence. And so they make the Torah peaceful and loving and kind through their power of interpretation. One more story. It's a story that's truly revolutionary and sort of describes the rabbinic revolution. So there's a discussion, a machloket, a disagreement about a certain oven. We don't have to figure out whether it can be kosher, it's not kosher, whatever it is. So Rabbi Eliezer is one rabbi, and he brought every argument under the sun, but they wouldn't accept it. So Rabbi Eliezer, who was a very holy rabbi, as we'll see in a moment, and a smart rabbi, he argued and brought every point, and the rabbis just wouldn't agree with it. It's the minority against the majority, right? So he's one person, and that's the law, right? The majority rules in Rabbinic Judaism. It's very democratic, as we learned, not hierarchical. Then Rabbi Eliezer said, if the law goes according to me, the carob tree will prove it. So right, if I'm right, let a miracle will happen. And it happened. The carob tree uprooted and moved 100 yards. The carob tree jumped out of the ground and moved 100 yards. And the rabbi said, look, this is a house of study, that we don't accept proof from trees, right? It's inadmissible in the rabbinic courts. And he did it again. The river flowed backwards. And they said, no, we don't accept it. They finally said the walls of the house of study will collapse, right? And then, right, so miracles started happening. He was right? God was saying, Rabbi Eliezer is correct. Even though we usually say the majority rules, in this case, it seems as God was behind Rabbi Eliezer, who was in the minority. Finally, Rabbi Eliezer said, if the law goes according to me, let heaven prove it. And the divine voice came from heaven and said, what are you arguing about? The law goes according to Rabbi Eliezer on all matters. Even if he's the minority, he's the smartest, he's the brightest, he's right, right? So an actual voice, right? So it's a legend, right? An actual voice came from heaven and said, Rabbi Eliezer, who is the minority opinion, is correct. Rabbi Joshua, who was a very well-respected rabbi, got to his feet and shouted, it is not in heaven. So what does that mean? Rabbi Yirmiyah explains, the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai. From that point on, we don't rule according to divine voices, right? Prophets, right, and our ancestors, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, they spoke to God, but we don't speak to God, right? The Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, and we don't listen. We don't have divine voices anymore. As it says, after the majority, you should incline. You already wrote in your Torah the rules for Rabbinic Judaism, and they are the majority wins. And so they defied the voice from heaven, right? This is the rabbinic revolution, right? It says, look, we don't have the Holy Temple anymore. We don't have direct connection with God. We're on our own, right? We're independent, and it's time for us to make these decisions. So sometime later, again, this is legend, right? Rabbi Natan met Elijah the prophet, right? Elijah sort of floats between this world and the world of the spirit, right? And shows up right at certain times, the spirit of Elijah. And so Rabbi Natan said, what was God doing? When the rabbis revolted successfully against God, what was God doing at the time? How did God respond? Elijah replied, the Holy One was laughing, right? Sort of shaking his head back and forth and saying, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me, right? And so legend has it, right, that right, when he said that, he was actually saying that with bitter and sweet, right? On one hand, right, he kind of lost his grip on his children. right? Almost like, right? So back in the desert, we were carried through the desert on the wings of an eagle, right? God fed us with manna, protected us with the clouds of glory, took us through, right? With a mighty hand and outstretched arm. It was like a parent and an infant, right? He took care of us completely. God took care of us completely. But now, right, the Jewish people, the Israelites have evolved. And it's time for us to live on our own, almost like adult children with their parents, right? And it says, look, they're all grown up now. Right? Rabbinic Judaism is strong and independent. My children have defeated me. Yeah, what can I do? Right? And so that's sort of the essential text in the Talmud that brings us the affirmation of Rabbinic Judaism. Right? And that's the phrase that God uses, that we remember that, right? We now have the responsibility to make Judaism work, right? We went from biblical Judaism through prophetic Judaism, through priestly Judaism, and now we've derived at Rabbinic Judaism, which is a more independent Judaism, which is a more democratic Judaism, and a Judaism that's portable, that we can all be proud of. All right, friends. Thank you for the hour. Round of applause for my in-laws. Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for those who are watching after this class. I appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thanks.
See you soon.